30 days in the county jail or a $500 fine? The judge's gavel slammed down, his voice cold as he sentenced the homeless man in front of him. The man only bowed his head, too broken to speak. Judge Raymond Holt thought he'd seen it all in his small Iowa courtroom until the Marine stood up in silence. And everything changed. Who was this man? Why did the Marines intervene? What's the greatest injustice you've witnessed turned into hope? Let's find out. Welcome to True Quiet Stories. Let's uncover what happened in this story. If you love these stories, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing. In a small Iowa town, the air smells of cornfields and justice. Judge Raymond Holt presided there. He was 52 years old. He worked as a district judge in Clayton County Courthouse, a modest building on Main Street that echoed with the weight of the law. Raymond's days were structured. He heard cases, reviewed evidence, and issued rulings, his hand steady from years on the bench. He nodded at lawyers, even when the caseload piled up, even when the stories blurred together, even when the weight of his own decisions felt too heavy to bear. His graying hair was always neatly combed, his black robe crisp and imposing, his eyes sharp but weary, a weariness that came from a heart that had known order, that had known rules, that had known judgment, a heart that ruled more than it felt. Even when the town demanded more, even when the cases whispered mercy, even when the years seemed to take more than they offered. Raymond lived alone in a modest house on Oak Street, a tidy space with a leather armchair, a bookshelf of law journals, and a window that overlooked the quiet town square, the hum of cicadas a constant reminder of the things he couldn't escape, of the things he couldn't change, of the things he couldn't feel. His wife, who'd once softened his edges, had passed away 8 years ago, a long battle with cancer, leaving Raymond to face the courtroom alone, to keep his rulings firm, alone, to hold on to his principles alone, even in the silence, even in the dusk, even in the years that had passed since she was gone. Raymond kept going. He worked hard, but he had a rigid heart. He judged more than he listened. It was all he knew. Raymond's life in Elkader, Iowa, was a daily march through protocol and the past. The town had seen better days, its streets lined with aging storefronts, its farms struggling through harsh winters, its people worn by years of hard work, years of dreams deferred, years of a life that seemed to take more than it gave. Elkader was a small community, just over 1,200 people, a place where everyone knew everyone, where Clayton County Courthouse had been a fixture for over a century. A building where locals sought justice, shared grievances, and found resolution. A place that Raymond's father had served as a bailiff, that Raymond had risen to judge, that Raymond fought to keep impartial, even when the odds were against him, even when the cases grew heavy, even when the town seemed to forget the courthouse, to forget his family, to forget him. He grew up in Elkader, in a small house on Pine Road, where his parents had raised him with discipline, with structure, with the belief that justice was the greatest gift you could give, that order was the greatest thing you could hold, that the law was the greatest thing you could serve, even when the world was harsh, even when the nights were long, even when the lessons were heavy. His father, Walter, had been a bailiff, his hands steady as he maintained order, his voice firm as he called cases, his pride a bright spot in their small home, a pride that Raymond still felt even now, years after he was gone, years after a heart attack took him, years after the courthouse became his burden, his duty, his life. His mother, Evelyn, had been a school teacher, her smile a comfort to every student, her hands quick as she graded papers, her faith a steady anchor for their family. Her prayers a nightly ritual that Raymond still remembered, even now, years after she was gone, years after dementia took her, years after the courthouse became his responsibility, his legacy, his purpose. They didn't have much money, their meals simple but hearty, roast on Sundays, soup on weekdays, a rare treat of pie when the budget allowed. But they had each other, and that made their small house a fortress a place where Raymond always felt secure, always felt guided, always felt driven. Those memories were all Raymond had left after his wife passed, a slow loss that came over 2 years, her laughter silenced, her warmth gone, a void he couldn't fill. She'd been his balance, his confidant, his reminder of mercy, and her death in that hospital bed shattered the life they'd built, leaving Raymond with nothing but the courthouse, the house, the silence that filled his days, his nights, his heart. He'd been 44 then, his hand still steady, his principles still firm, but his world forever changed, his heart heavy, with grief, with solitude, with a life that seemed to demand more than he could give, more than he could bear, more than he could hold. He threw himself into his work, judging from morning to evening, his hand steady as he signed orders, his voice firm as he issued rulings, his heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of duty, with the weight of a courtroom that was always demanding, a courtroom that hadn't seen mercy in years, a courtroom that reminded him of everything he'd lost, everything he couldn't afford, everything he couldn't feel, even in the silence, even in the dusk, even in the years that had kept him apart. But Raymond had a rigid heart, a heart that still beat with the lessons his parents taught him, with the structure they'd instilled, with the judgment he held above all else, a judgment that lived on in the rulings he issued, even now, even here, even in the courtroom where no one saw him, where no one cared, where no one knew. He worked with precision, taking pride in the law he upheld, making sure every case was fair, every ruling was just, every sentence was firm, a strict standard for the people who filled his days, even if they never understood, even if they never thanked him, even if they never saw the effort he put in, the duty he poured into every verdict, the rigidity he gave to every decision. The Clayton County Courthouse was heavy with the weight of judgment that afternoon, the air thick with the scent of old wood and tension. Judge Raymond Holt sat high on his bench, his gavel still echoing from the sentence he'd just delivered, his eyes fixed on the man before him with a cold, unwavering stare. The courtroom was sparse, a few onlookers scattered across the wooden benches, their whispers barely audible over the creak of the floorboards. Raymond adjusted his robe, his hand steady, despite the flicker of unease in his chest, a flicker he ignored, a flicker that reminded him of the mercy he'd long buried, a flicker that he couldn't afford, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the moments that passed him by. He looked down at the defendant, a man whose name he'd barely registered, a man whose plea he'd dismissed, a man whose story he didn't care to hear, a story he understood as guilt, a story he felt as routine, a story he couldn't ignore. He didn't know the man's past, didn't know his pain, didn't know the weight he carried, but he knew the law, the look of a thief, the need for order, even if it meant judgment, even if it meant harshness, even if it meant overlooking. The man's quiet despair. The man's name was Henry Ellis, though Raymond didn't bother to dwell on it, didn't know the story behind those sunken eyes, didn't know the weight he carried, the weight of a war that had taken everything, the weight of a life that had left him with nothing, the weight of a silence that had become his only companion, his only comfort, his only truth. Henry was 68 years old, a homeless veteran who'd been living on the streets of El Cader for years, a man who'd served as a lance corporal in the U.S. Marine Corps, who'd fought in the jungles of Vietnam in 1969, who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, who'd done things he couldn't undo, who'd lost things he couldn't reclaim. He'd been a hero once, a man who'd saved his squad during a night ambush, dragging wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire, his own body scarred by shrapnel, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't save, by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him to the courtroom, where he now stood, where he now trembled, where he now survived, on the edges of a town that had forgotten him, on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, a tattered dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. Henry had lost everything. After the war, his family, his home, his health, his very sense of self, the war a thief that had taken more than he could ever hope to reclaim. He'd come home to El-Khadr in 1971, a different man than the one who'd left, his body weakened by injuries, his smile gone, his heart heavier with the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the things he couldn't undo. His wife, Margaret, had tried to help, her gentle hands a comfort, her soft voice a lifeline, her love a beacon in the darkness that had consumed him, that had changed him, that had broken him in ways she couldn't fix, in ways he couldn't share, in ways they couldn't survive. But the nightmares were too much, the flashbacks too real, the guilt too heavy, the PTSD too strong, a force that pulled him under, that pulled him away, that pulled him apart, until Margaret couldn't hold on anymore, until she passed away from cancer in 1985, leaving Henry alone with their daughter Ellie, a daughter who grew up and moved to Chicago, seeking a life far from the shadow of a father who couldn't find his way back, who couldn't find his peace, who couldn't find his home. Henry didn't blame her, didn't fight her, didn't beg her to stay, knowing she was right, knowing he was broken, knowing he couldn't be the father Ellie deserved, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be again. Henry had been arrested for stealing a loaf of bread from the local market, a desperate act to survive another day, a loaf that held the promise of a meal, a loaf that held the weight of his hunger, a loaf that held the shame of his fall, even in the silence, even in the cold, even in the years that had kept him apart. He lived in a makeshift shelter behind the town's abandoned mill, a crumbling structure with a tarp roof, a tattered blanket his only warmth, a cracked flashlight his only light, a small tin box his only possession, a box that held the things that mattered most to him, the things that kept him going, the things that reminded him of the man he'd been, even if he couldn't feel it anymore, even if he couldn't find it anymore, even if he couldn't live it anymore. Inside the box was a faded photo of Margaret and Ellie, taken on Ellie's 5th birthday, their smiles bright against a sunny park backdrop, a moment of joy frozen in time, a moment Henry held on to, a moment that broke his heart, that kept him alive, that kept him hoping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know how, even if he didn't know what for. There was also a letter Margaret wrote him during the war. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still legible. Words of love and hope that had kept him going through the darkest nights. Words he read when the loneliness felt too heavy, too bare. And there was his Silver Star, a medal he'd been awarded for his bravery in Vietnam, a medal he'd buried in the box, a medal he couldn't look at, a medal that felt like a mockery of the pain he carried, of the lives he couldn't save, of the man he'd once been, a man he'd lost, a man he'd never be again. Henry didn't fight the sentence that day, didn't plead, didn't let Raymond see the depth of his despair, even though he had no money for the fine, even though jail meant another cold night, even though his voice was too weak to speak, a weakness he understood, a weakness he felt, a weakness he couldn't hide. He stood there, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the table, his eyes downcast with shame, his heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of survival, with the weight of a life that had been reduced to this, even if he didn't expect mercy, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know what would come of it. The courtroom in Clayton County Courthouse felt colder than ever as Henry Ellis stood before the bench, the weight of Judge Raymond Holt's sentence hanging over him like a storm cloud that refused to break. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and the murmur of the few onlookers, their eyes fixed on the frail man in tattered clothes. His shoulders slumped under the burden of a life that had stripped him bare. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, the faded American flag in the corner standing as a silent witness to the proceedings, its stars and stripes a stark contrast to the grayness that clung to Henry's existence. Raymond adjusted his glasses, his movements precise as he prepared to move on to the next case, his mind already shifting to the docket, his heart unmoved by the man he'd just sentenced, a man he saw as a thief, a man he judged without knowing, a man whose story he'd dismissed with the slam of his gavel, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the moments that passed him by. Henry didn't look up, didn't speak, didn't let Raymond see the depth of his despair. Even though the sentence meant 30 days in a cell, he knew his body couldn't endure, even though he had no money to pay the $500 fine. Even though his bones ached with the chill that had settled into them after years on the streets, a chill he understood, a chill he felt, a chill he couldn't escape. He stood there, a broken man, his eyes fixed on the scuffed floorboards, his heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of survival, with the weight of a life that had been reduced to this moment, even if he didn't expect mercy, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know what would come of it. Henry's story hadn't gone unnoticed, not by everyone, not by those who saw beyond the tattered clothes and the courtroom docket, not by those who knew the weight of a past unspoken, the power of a heroism unseen, the value of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. In the back of the courtroom sat a man who'd been watching silently, a man who'd seen more than most, a man whose own life had been shaped by the kind of sacrifice Henry embodied, a man whose heart stirred with a recognition that went deeper than the law could ever reach. His name was Robert Daniels, a 60-year-old lawyer and a retired Marine, a man who'd served in Vietnam alongside men like Henry, who'd known heroes, who'd faded into the shadows, who'd carried the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Henry bore, a silence Robert recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Robert had been in the courtroom that day on a different case, his hands resting on a briefcase filled with papers, his eyes catching the quiet man at the front, the way Henry's hands trembled as he stood, the way his dog tag glinted faintly. Under the courtroom lights, the way the moment held a weight Robert couldn't ignore, a weight that spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of a hero forgotten, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the years that had kept him apart. He'd approached Henry after the initial hearing, his voice steady but warm as he asked about the dog tag, about the war, about the life Henry had lived, about the pain he'd carried, even if Henry's words were few, even if he'd given up. Hope, even if he'd never expected anyone to care, even in the silence, even in the courtroom, even in the years that had kept him apart. Robert had seen the flicker of a story in Henry's eyes, a story of courage buried beneath layers of hardship, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that demanded to be told. Robert didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, wouldn't stop there, knowing Henry's story deserved more, knowing his sacrifice deserved more, knowing a hero deserved more than a cold sentence in a forgotten courtroom, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the years that had kept him apart. He drove to the local Marine recruiting office that evening, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned, with the weight of what he knew he had to do, with the weight of a story that deserved to be told, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that deserved to be honored, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without them. The office was a small brick building on the edge of town, its walls lined with posters of Marines. In uniform, its desk cluttered with recruitment pamphlets, its atmosphere charged with the quiet pride of service. Robert called his old commanding officer, Major General Thomas Reed, a man who'd served in Vietnam, who'd known Marines like Henry, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Henry carried, a silence Thomas recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Robert told him everything, his voice steady as he spoke of Henry's Silver Star, of the squad he'd saved in Vietnam, of the life that had crumbled after, of the man who stood in a courtroom with nothing left but his memories, even in the Sioux. Silence, even in the dusk, even in the years that had kept him apart. Thomas listened, his own heart stirring with the weight of a brother Marine's story, a story he'd heard echoes of in his own life, a story he knew needed to be honored, a story he couldn't let fade into the shadows of a small-town courtroom. On Nye, a quiet Wednesday morning, the sound of boots echoed through the Clayton County Courthouse, a steady rhythm that broke the stillness of the room, that stopped Raymond in his tracks as he prepared to call the next case, that made his heart pound with unease and curiosity, a sound that spoke of something big, something unexpected, a sound that would change everything, forever, for Raymond, for Henry, for the town of Elkader, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their honor, that would remember their sacrifice, their redemption, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the law that had kept them apart. The door to the courtroom swung open, and the onlookers turned, their whispers falling silent, as a group of U.S. Marines in dress uniforms entered, their faces set with purpose, their movements deliberate, their presence a testament to a brotherhood that spanned decades, a brotherhood that had come to right a wrong, a brotherhood that had come to honor one of their own, even in the silence, even in the courtroom, even in the years that had kept him apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Quiet Stories for more untold tales of valor. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.